yellow.
Welcome to the Prescription for Success podcast with your host, Dr. Randy Cook.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Prescription for Success podcast. I'm Dr. Randy Cook, and I'll be your host for the program. We'll get into today's interview in just a moment, but first I want to remind everyone that our podcast is sponsored by MD Coaches, a company dedicated to empowering physicians to realize a greater potential and to achieve a greater level of satisfaction in their chosen fields. You can find MD Coaches on the web at mymdcoaches.com. My interview guest today is Dr. Dael Waxman, who is a professor of family medicine at Atrium Health in Charlotte, North Carolina. Dr. Waxman also serves as the medical director of physician well-being for medical education at Atrium Health and medical director of patient-centered programming at Atrium CMC-Mercy. On a national and international level, he served on the board of directors for Plaintree International, an organization committed to exceptional person-centered healthcare. I think you'll find that his professional journey is an interesting story. So now let's hear my interview with Dr. Dael Waxman. So I'm delighted to be talking today with Dr. Dael Waxman, who is a professor of family medicine up in Charlotte, North Carolina, medical director of physician well-being, as I understand. Is that right, Dael?
That's correct. Uh-huh.
And welcome to the show. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Randy. It's a real pleasure for me to be here as well.
And as always, as Alice was advised in Wonderland, I want to start at the beginning. And I want you to tell us a little bit about how you got interested in medicine. Did you know where you were headed when you matriculated at University of Kansas in the mid-'70s, or was it something that came along later? What's the story?
It's a very interesting story. It was not necessarily something that came to me early or easily. I kind of knew that I was going to medical school when I came home from my freshman orientation in undergraduate school, and I shared with my father that here's the courses that I've established for first semester, and he said, "Well, where are the pre-med courses?" And I said, "Really?" So it was at that moment that I had this sense that where I was heading wasn't exactly where I thought I was heading. So I wasn't aware that I was going to med school until kind of that moment. And you know, there's a lot to deconstruct about that with respect to my father. He was a child of the Depression, and I think that he saw that he wanted to be sure that each of his sons had a secure future just from that kind of experience that he grew up in. And one of my brothers had successfully done that, gone through the medical school piece, and I think he liked that. In addition, his older brother was a physician, and also it's a little bit of a family business. I have 26 first cousins on my father's side. 9 of us are physicians, and the rest are professions. And yeah, exactly.
That's really remarkable.
So there really was some family energy around that, and so I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't know what I was wanting to do before going to undergraduate school, and I was pretty good in a lot of things. And as a 18-year-old, I kind of rebelled against that a little bit with my father, and I didn't necessarily go along with it easily. And so I didn't do very well in the first pre-med class. But then later on in college, I said, I know I can do better than that. And I wanted to just prove to myself that I can actually do that course and do well in it. I don't know that it's going to lead me to medical school, but I wanted to do that. And I think it was also kind of pleasing my father as well.
Were you considering other things? I mean, was it? Did you have other things in your head that you thought might be a possibility, or were you like a lot of 18-year-olds who really hadn't given it enough thought to even try to make a decision at that point?
Well, one of my main interests in high school and in college, I was involved in theater, but I knew that, and I was in acting, and I knew that was not necessarily going to be a secure future. I knew that. I just knew that I liked it, and so I started out as a radio, TV, film major, thinking that, well, maybe I can get into production. And I actually didn't really care for that very much either when I saw kind of what was involved in all that. But I liked the idea of performance and being on stage, if you will. So really, I was really in undergraduate just sort of looking for what kind of fits for me. And I stayed involved in theater while I was in undergraduate school, while I was doing pre-med classes as well. So I did redo freshman chemistry, and I did really well. And then I just said, well, as long as I'm doing well in this, I think I'll continue on this path and see where it takes me. And one thing led to another, and I was very successful in it once I got my head around it, and applied to medical school, and there I was. And
at about what point along the way of your undergraduate education did you know that you had come to a decision?
It was probably my junior year, and I had a lot of catching up to do as well. And I had I had a lot of catching up to do. And interestingly, I had a pre-med advisor. I had to do all these pre-med classes junior year, and that's a lot. And without a lot of other. It was all
Indeed.
Science classes, which doesn't necessarily come easily to me. And I considered maybe I could do this over 5 years. And the pre-med advisor said, no, the medical schools don't look easily on that. They prefer you go through in 4 years. Otherwise, it looks not great.
Really?
Well, yeah, that's what I was told.
Yeah.
And then I get to med school, and about a third of the class had done exactly that. And I was still a little bit angry at that pre-med advisor.
And then how about the medical school application process? What was that like for you?
Yeah, I think pretty standard. I just I applied to a few schools. Some were very interesting to me. I got accepted only in the one that I went to at the University of Kansas. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that helped that, number one, I had some cousins that had gone through there. My brother had gone through there as well. But the other thing is I had done some research over a summer at the University of Kansas in, interestingly, some early research in cancer immunotherapy. This is over 40 years ago we were doing this, and now it's kind of standard practice, which is kind of cool. And one of the interviewers that I had was one of the researchers kind of down the hall who I had become familiar with. And I think he, in the interview, he asked me some specific questions about the research that enabled me to shine in front of some of the other interviewers. And so I think that helped as well.
And it sounds like, at least in the beginning, you actually felt like you might have been academically challenged in the early part of your undergraduate years, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but evidently you sort of learned how to deal with the academics and obviously were successful. Did you find medical school particularly challenging once you got there?
As I indicated, the sciences don't necessarily come easy to me. I have to really work hard to understand it, and to wrap my head around a lot of the concepts. And so I had figured out a way to study in pre-med that allowed me to excel in that, even though it wasn't necessarily natural and easy and interesting. And that particular methodology did not work very well in medical school because it was just the sheer volume of the material. It was something I could...
That's a common theme.
Yeah. I could master it as a pre-med, but in the volume of it in medical school. And I have a very, very clear memory of the very first gross anatomy exam on the upper extremity, which I think is common. And I studied like I'd never studied for anything before, including, putting aside some of the other courses that we were taking at the time. And at the end of it, at the exam, I scored in the middle of the class, which is great in medical school, but at what expense? And I went, wow, how am I going to do this, with all the classes? And so it was not easy. It was a struggle.
But again, primarily because of the volume, as opposed to the difficulty of the subjects.
Well, yeah, it was predominantly the volume. Like I said, science isn't real easy, as a category. But by that point, I knew how to wrap my head around it. So it's predominantly volume. And then the other piece for me is that once I decided, I'm going to do this medical school thing, I also knew that I wanted to do this in, what are the areas that are interesting to me about being a physician? And for me, it's really about relational care and, person-centeredness and humanistic. And it's a little different now in medical education, but in those days, the first 2 years, there was little to nothing that resembled anything to do with patient care, anything to do with relationships.
Absolutely.
And so I felt kind of lost in those first couple of years. And it really was a struggle. And in fact, I ended up taking a year leave of absence between the first and second year to really sort through, once again, is this something that I want to do?
Well, that kind of leads into my next question, because what you're saying, I hear a lot in these interviews, and that is the first couple of years were just kind of grueling, sort of an endurance test. But most people, once they get into the clinical years, feel like it got significantly more comfortable, if not easier. And I'm wondering if you had that same experience, because that's not entirely universal. So I'm interested in what your take on that was.
Yeah, definitely. I was looking forward to the actual being with the patients, and that was much better in the third and fourth year. I also we had a regional medical school in Kansas in Wichita. So for my third and fourth years, we moved from Kansas City to Wichita. And one of the goals of those days in the Wichita campus was to increase the number of folks getting out into rural medicine and primary care. So primary care was very much emphasized, and primary care is very relational, and it was a smaller group of students, and we were all pretty close and connected. So it was a much better atmosphere, more in line with me.
So you actually you felt like you had some encouragement strictly based on the way they had structured the curriculum to get you in family practice.
Yeah, I think I knew a little enough about primary care or family practice to know that seemed to be where I was heading, and I wanted to go to a place where that was emphasized. So it just got reinforced by going there.
Yeah, that's interesting. So tell us a little bit more about what those years were like, your clinical years.
Yeah, so one of the great places about that, the third and fourth year there, as opposed to a large academic health center, was at the time they had, there were 50 students per year, so they had 100 students there at the time. And a large part of the community, the medical community, were part of the education. They had something like 300 or 400 physicians who agreed to teach the medical students.
Wow.
They had some full-time faculty, but most of the people that taught us were practicing clinicians. And it was awesome from a student's point of view. We were just kind of hanging out with people in their practices doing the things that they did. And so a lot of modeling, the teaching was more of a modeling kind of an apprentice kind of style teaching. But I still am impressed with the dedication that medical community had for the education of medical students. They just volunteered their time.
I think that's kind of unique. Most of us, I think, particularly those that trained in the years that I did, were accustomed to being taught by people who had 1 year more experience than we did. And you were actually right at the side of somebody who had decades of experience. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, to be sure, we did have some of our rotations. There were residencies, and so we had residents teaching us. But a lot of them were these community clinicians. So it was fantastic. I think the best part of those 2 years was we all had a required rural, either primary care or surgical rotation. So we all had to go out for a month or 2 months into rural Kansas and live in that community and be with one clinician. And for those who are interested in the surgical specialties, they would generally go with the general surgeon. And those of us in primary care, it was a primary care physician. And that was the best month of all of medical school. And I was with a family physician, Rick Kellerman, who is still a mentor of mine in the town of Plainville, Kansas, which is out in western Kansas, town of about 2,000 people. And, primary care, family medicine in Kansas truly is everything. Deliveries, forceps deliveries, some minor surgery, and he even ran chemotherapy for people. And the autonomy that he gave me and the teaching that he gave me was exceptional. And not just the clinical piece. One day he said, tomorrow's Saturday, wear some grubby clothes because we're going to go out into the community so you can learn something about how this community operates. So, all right, wow. Whatever that's about. So we went out and visited some cattle farmers, and we went out to some oil rigs to learn something about how this economy flows in this community. And he said, you have to go to the high school basketball games so that you understand how a primary care physician is in this community, how they operate. So it was
That's a great idea.
Yeah, it was in all dimensions an excellent, excellent experience.
Well, from that, it's pretty easy for me to see how you found inspiration to go into family practice. And having made that decision, you made the decision to move on to the University of Arizona. And I'm interested in how you picked Arizona.
Great question. So some of the faculty in family medicine in Wichita were aware of my interest in the person-centered humanistic, or the words we have for that these days, but my interest in the mental health aspects and how mental health overlies primary care. So when I did primary care, I was really intrigued by how the person experienced this, what was going on with them in terms of their mental health, and how that might be influencing how the family and the context was influencing their health and their illness, and how their health and illness was influencing the family. And I didn't really have words for that at the time. That's what my propensity was. And one of my faculty members in Wichita had read an article written by a faculty member at the University of Arizona that dealt with one of those issues. It was, how do you deal with borderline personality in a primary care practice? And I said, well, that's really fascinating. And so I sought out that faculty member, and I actually went and did a sub-internship at the University of Arizona because he was there. And I found myself really liking that environment and really wanted to be with him because he was a mentor. His name was Michael McGill. And so that's why I selected the University of Arizona. Not that it was necessarily a big part of the curriculum there, but that he was there. And I seemed to connect with it, and I liked Tucson, and it seemed like a cool place to be for residency. So that's how I ended up there.
That's a good reason to make the pick. I mean, it sounds like it was kind of tailor-made for your interests. And so, again, it sounds like as you move along, you're feeling gradually more comfortable in the situation. And was that, in fact, the case? Was residency a really good experience for you? Sounds like it was.
It was validating to be in a family medicine residency. I liked my colleagues. I liked the faculty who, it was good to be immersed in that specialty and that philosophy. I, like other residents, again, these are the days before the work hours restrictions, which I know you know well as well. There's just was not, it just was a number of hours caught up with me. And I did get burnt out middle of second year. And, we didn't have the words for that at the time either. I just plain didn't have the energy didn't feel like I had the energy to continue on. I did. And I got some help at the time to kind of help me think through that, because when you're burnt out, your thinking goes like, this isn't for me. And it's hard to see that this isn't what it's going to look like when you're done.
Where did the help come from?
So I went and saw a therapist, and the therapist, and I had actually seen some other folks within the medical setting, but I got the sense that, or I had the perception that their investment is me staying right there. So so it wasn't, I didn't see it as potentially really helpful. So I said, I need to get a therapist who's outside of the medical environment. And she actually said in the very first session, she said, let me just make sure I understand this. She says, you're halfway done with your residency training. And if you finish it, that gives you a lot more options than if you stop right now. And I said, yeah. And she said, well, we're going to work on this, and we're going to work on, whether this all fits for you or not. But can you at least commit to finishing, so that at least, you may choose something totally different after this, but can you commit to finishing? And I thought that was really brilliant of her, because
I'll say,
yeah,
that's really profound.
Yeah. So I did. I said, yeah, I can commit to finishing, and we'll work through why is this what it is. And
so you sort of had a contract.
We had a contract, and I did, and I finished.
And good for all of us that you did. And then as you moved on, you got into some very interesting territory, and in fact, territory that I am completely unfamiliar with. You did a fellowship in faculty development. What's that all about?
Yes. Well, so even though I finished residency, towards the end of the residency, I still wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do next. I did not see myself as going into full-time practice. All I knew is that just didn't quite fit for me. I liked patient care, but I just couldn't see myself doing that full time. And my advisor in the residency had said, you seem to have a propensity for teaching, and I wonder if you'd be interested in this fellowship that we have here. And by the way, you could be chief resident of the family medicine residency at the same time. So I said, okay, well, this gives me something to do while I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do. And so I did, stayed there in Arizona as a fourth-year chief resident of the residency, as well as did this faculty development fellowship, which is a fellowship in learning how to be a faculty member, learning how to teach, learning how to do lectures, learning how to do group learning, learning how to help learners develop their learning objectives, curriculum.
And was there actually, and I apologize for interrupting, but were there also clinical responsibilities concurrent with that?
Yeah, sure. So I still was seeing patients probably I'd guess about 40 to 50% of my time. I was also attending. So I attended on inpatient, and I would be attending, but I'd have a co-attending to give me feedback about how I was teaching. So, and in family medicine, I was still doing full service family medicine. So I was still doing deliveries and all the other clinical piece as well. Yeah.
That's very interesting. And then at the conclusion of that, you went on to yet another fellowship in family systems medicine. That was up in Rochester. And there again, this is something I'm unfamiliar with. So please tell us the story.
Sure. Yeah. So again, going back to the thread of my interest in person-centered humanistic care, and not feeling like I had enough of that in residency, I felt like I didn't get enough in the way of how do I actually do this counseling thing? Because in primary care, we end up being the de facto mental health providers. Right. And I didn't feel well equipped. I knew how to prescribe medication, but that isn't necessarily what people need or want for some of the mental health issues. And I didn't feel that I had the counseling skills piece. So I knew that I wanted that, and I didn't know where that would emerge or where I would get that. And this is one of these sort of spiritual serendipitous moments. I was literally in the library at the University of Arizona School of Medicine, preparing for a talk I was giving to the residents on inpatient. And I was in the library. These are back in the days before you search things on the computer, right? So I pulled out I found an Index Medicus article that I wanted to go get. And I went to get the bound volume that this article was in. And I opened, you open the page, right, to see where you are. And I opened up the volume, and it wasn't the page that I needed, but on that page, I saw a letter to the editor. And the letter to the editor contained the word biopsychosocial. And I went, well, that's an interesting term. And what does that mean? And I'm looking at this letter, and the letter was from George Engel, who was an internist and psychoanalyst from the University of Rochester, who had started a fellowship in what's called psychosocial medicine. And he said, we have this fellowship in psychosocial medicine at the University of Rochester. Now, the volume was a few years old, and I said, this sounds really intriguing. And I did a little research on it, and I said, this is what I'm after. It's expanding the biomedical model, which is very much using the biomedical science to figure out what's going on in the body, and expanding it to the person and the community and the family. And that's just really fit with me. And so I wrote him a letter, and I said, I saw this letter to the editor. I heard there's this fellowship. Can you tell me more about that? And he wrote me back, and he said, I'm no longer with it, but the fellowship exists. And why don't you write to this person? So I wrote to this person, and then and they wrote back, and they said, yeah, we do have this fellowship. If you're interested, apply this way. Meanwhile, I'm talking to a faculty member in Arizona who had come from University of Rochester. He'd done his family medicine residency there, and he said, I think there's another fellowship in what's called family systems. And I said, what is that? And he goes, I'm not quite sure, but let me put you in touch with the people at Rochester that are doing that. So I got in touch with them, and they said, yes, we do have this fellowship, and why don't you come out? So I went out and interviewed for both of them, and I was there for a week. And by the end of the week, they basically said, actually, we see a lot of similarities between both these fellowships. We're going to combine efforts and make this one kind of experience, even though there's two different fellowships. So I can tell you, when I went there to interview, what they told me, what this was going to be about, just absolutely fit me. So what family systems is using systems theory. And in family systems, in family therapy, they use systems theory to understand how families interact with each other interpersonally. And systems theory is actually familiar to those of us in medicine. It's really biology is about systems theory. If you look at the cell has lots of interactions in different parts, but each of those parts will influence the other parts of the cell. That's basically systems theory. When there is a system, when one part of that system is affected, other parts of the system are affected too. So if you apply that to families, when a family member is ill, it affects the whole family. And when we know that just intrinsically, but how do we really deconstruct that and look at what that means, and how do we help families through when that happens? And vice versa, if the family is very healthy, how does that improve health of the individual? So one of the ways that this family systems medicine piece of the fellowship was, I actually trained as a family therapist for 2 years to really immerse myself in that model. And then I wasn't really intending to be a family therapist. It was just how do I then apply that to primary care? And so practically speaking, for your listeners, what that means is that I am attuned to what's going on in the context of the patient as a way of understanding all the different factors that are influencing their health and illness. And also vice versa. How is your health and illness influencing, and how is it being handled by your family? So that was the family systems part of that fellowship.
I got to tell you, I really love that story. Not only because of your very succinct discussion of family systems, but the fact that it came about because of a page that fell open in a library. And I really do hate to sound like a terribly worn out old man, but I really think we've lost something because we don't go into libraries anymore and leaf through the books. That was a big moment for you. Literally changed your life, I think you could say, because you happened to spot something in a part of a volume that you weren't really expecting to find anything. It's incredible.
Absolutely. That totally changed my life. It totally validated something that had been on my mind for, by that point, 8 years. And I didn't have words for it.
So let's take just a short break for a minute or two. I want to take a moment to talk to you about a new sponsor that we have here on Prescription for Success. Physician Outlook is a new magazine platform built for physicians and by physicians, and it's designed to showcase unique physician talents. Sometimes it might be clinical talents, but mostly it's about the intersection between clinical and non-clinical talents, whether it be writing or painting or cooking, or maybe even making a political statement in front of a state and local governing body, or even at the nation's capital, and dozens of other things. It's available online and in print. It's visually stunning on all of its platforms. I promise it's really unique in terms of physician lifestyle magazines. I think you'll really enjoy it. We think it's just the thing to fill your prescription for success. And like the Prescription for Success podcast, Physician Outlook magazine amplifies the voice of any doctor who has something to say, and also uniquely engages patients who still believe in physician-led, team-based care. And Prescription for Success listeners can get $20 off an annual subscription fee by visiting rxforsuccesspodcast.com/Physician Outlook. And now let's get back to today's interview.
If you don't mind, I want to talk about the psychosocial fellowship part of that. That was also
exactly
unbelievable. This was the George Engel model, and George Engel brought about this thing called the biopsychosocial model, and that phrase was introduced to the literature in the 1970s. But he was in the 50s and 60s, pretty pioneering and some would say revolutionary, and even introducing this concept that there's something beyond biomedicine going on here that influences health and illness. And we take that for granted now, but he was kind of an anarchist in some ways. But he would literally I think he got this from his psychoanalytic training, that there was this understanding that the psyche has a lot to do with how people are doing physically as well. So he developed his interest, it was, what is the patient's story? And not their story about their history of present illness and the review of systems. It's, how are you experiencing yourself right now? And his hypothesis was, that is not only just as, it's as important as all of the medical data, but it's also scientific information. And the way that he would teach that is by interviewing patients. And so the first month of my fellowship on the psychosocial end of things, now this is not something we can do anymore, but it wasn't with George, it was some of the people that he had trained. Here's what we would do. We would meet on a ward, and there would be the 5 of us fellows, and there would be one of the faculty members of the fellowship. And they said, okay, we're here to learn this interviewing thing. And one of you is going to interview, and we're going to go into a patient room, and you're going to just start interviewing them questions about their experience. The rest of us are going to have note cards, and we're going to take notes and watch what's happening. Then we're all going to go debrief that and talk about what we're noticing in the actual interview. And we literally would, now I think the instructor would ahead of time ask the charge nurse, what room are we not allowed to go into? But we wouldn't go in those rooms. We literally would walk into a room of a patient that we didn't know anything about, intentionally not knowing anything about the medical history. And one of us would start talking to the patient, and we'd ask things mostly about their experience here, their experience with their illness. And then through this patient-centered interviewing, kind of go deeper and deeper and deeper into how are they experiencing what is happening with respect to their health and illness. How is this affecting them? How is it affecting their family? And literally we would do that for like 10 minutes and then go into a room and talk about it for like an hour and a half. We'd like totally deconstruct stuff.
That's really interesting. And if I can ask you just one little detail about that, were the patients aware of kind of what was going on with that? Did they know why this person was there?
Well, they didn't know. And in those, we didn't even, pretty sure the nurses didn't even ask permission for us to walk in. So this is like not good behavior. Don't do this. Don't try this at home.
Don't try this at home. Yeah.
But what we did is we did explain it at the beginning. We didn't necessarily say we're learning interviewing skills. We would just say we're a group of clinicians and we're here to learn about your experience of being here in the hospital.
Yeah.
And if you want to shut it off at any time, you're welcome to do that. That's pretty much what I remember that we did. Some of my other colleagues might remember it a little bit differently, but that's how I remember it. And it really was, I want to say it was not, if we felt that this was invasive, we would shut it off and leave. And that hardly was ever the case. As you know, a lot of people in hospitals are lonely. Mm-hmm. And so in a way, for them to be able to share their story was probably therapeutic, although that wasn't necessarily our goal at the time. Although that is the goal of this, by the way, of diving into their experience in that kind of a way. So yeah,
it's a really interesting story.
Yeah,
I appreciate you bringing that up.
And it was, I have to tell you, Randy, it was not easy, even for people who are interested in this, because we're so indoctrinated with wanting to get the medical story. And we had skills in that, right? So we all had done medical school and
right.
residency, and we knew what we wanted to, and to shut that off and just say, I'm just here to learn how this person is doing was really difficult. And it was difficult initially. And then as we got used to it, we saw the value in this. And we actually were able to pull George Engel out of retirement and do rounds with us. His favorite place was the emergency room. We used to do this in the emergency room also.
What a great idea.
Yeah. So it was a highly experiential learning of immersing myself in the biopsychosocial model, the psychosocial realm, and then this family systems realm as well for 2 years. It was, to me, it really honored all those pieces that had been somewhat quiescent without language to understand what I was interested in for all that time, pre-med as well as medical school and residency.
I'm going to share a little bit of a quick personal story with you because I'd like to get your reaction to this. I had the great good fortune to spend some time with Dr. Gail Stevens, who you may remember was instrumental in establishing family practice as a certifiable specialty.
Yes.
Actually got his start out in Kansas, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
And I had the opportunity to spend some time with him when he was establishing the School of Primary Medical Care in Huntsville, Alabama. And this was actually my very first patient care experience. And he was the guy that was introducing us to clinical medicine. And I remember vividly to this day, one of the first things that he said to us is that it's very important for you to understand that every patient that you see is someone who has made a decision that they want to be sick. And of course, I thought, and my colleagues thought, this is nuts. What is he talking about? And he went on to say, even though it sounds silly, people have all kinds of physical and mental problems, but they deal with them as long as they can. And at some point they decide that they need some help with that. And that's when they have decided that they want to be sick. They want to admit that they need help. And that's when they come to see the physician, and that it's our job to understand not only the pathophysiology of their illness, but what it is that caused them to come to that realization. And it sounds like that's exactly the territory you were in when you were walking into these people's rooms unannounced and getting deeply into their lives, which I think had to have been a great experience for you.
Oh, amazing! And I'm always delighted to meet people who got to work with Gail Stevens. He's a sage in my specialty, and did a lot of writing.
Yeah.
And in fact, just an interesting little circle back, my mentor in Plainville, Kansas, Rick Kellerman, who I mentioned before, actually interviewed Gail Stevens, similar to the way you're interviewing me right now. Right. And there's a whole tape of that and a transcript of that. He recognized, as did a lot of those folks early in the birth of my specialty, this need for the family doc to explore those areas. And we had a lot of different ways of languaging it, but it was so well recognized that when they set up family medicine residencies, they said that to be accredited as a residency, you have to have a faculty member that this is what they do. They attend to the psychological, psychosocial issues that happen in residency. So he is a sage. That's awesome that you got to work with him.
Yeah, I have. I tell people all the time that one of the most influential people in my surgical career was a family practitioner, and he really was. Had a lot of respect for him.
Yeah, neat.
So, all right, continuing with your story, I didn't mean to divert there. Looks like we've got you trained, and you're gonna get a job. You're gonna go to work, and first off, it's a faculty appointment at University of Texas in Galveston, and maybe tell us a little about how that came about and what was it like for you.
Sure. So I knew from this fellowship that what I wanted to do was to bring that energy to education. And so I knew after the fellowship, I'm heading for an academic career. And at the University of Texas medical branch in Galveston at the time, they had they were early in the wave of prioritizing primary care and family medicine, reprioritizing it at that medical school. And so they were hiring lots of folks at the time in the department to really bring that primary care to sharper focus in the medical school. So my first boss was Dr. Stephen Spann, who knew something about family systems medicine, and he had a couple of other faculty members there that also knew something about it. They didn't necessarily go through the training, but they were familiar enough, and he wanted to bring that focus to that department as well. And so, and I connected with I mentioned just a few minutes ago that there's always a behavioral medicine faculty in the department. It's usually a psychologist. And that person in that department, Dorothy Trevino, was very interested in collaborating with the physician to bring that education to the residents. And so it just seemed like the right place for me to go. And it was, there's a lot of energy, a lot of growth, a lot of resources for primary care to develop. And because of the dean's interest in having more visibility of primary care, there are a lot of opportunities for us across the campus. So I dove into anything that had anything to do with anything I was interested in. So while still continuing clinical medicine, full spectrum family medicine, including deliveries and intensive care, and then teaching that and attending, I also was involved in that behavioral medicine education. And then because I opened my mouth a lot about the way they were teaching clinical interviewing to the medical students, within a year, I ended up being in charge of that whole course for 200 medical students of teaching them medical interviewing. And then we redid that whole course also to kind of bring it more up to date into what makes sense for people to bring in the clinical interview beyond just the history, present illness, and review of systems. And I did some research while I was there as well, and specifically on somatizing patients. So it was a great place to get started because there's so many opportunities. So it was great. It was a great time that I was there.
Yeah. So it sounds like you were very satisfied that you had made the right decision way back when you were a freshman in college, and you were in a good spot. And I know there was another faculty appointment in Connecticut. Ultimately, you landed where you are in Charlotte as the medical director of behavioral medicine. And again, I'm very interested that this concept even exists, and I'd like to hear what you have to say about it.
Sure. So behavioral medicine, as I've mentioned, the piece of making sure we're attending to the mental health, psychological factors that influence health. So we have to have, for family medicine programs, have to have somebody who specializes that as part of the faculty. What's not typical is that person is a physician, a family physician. Sometimes it's a psychiatrist. So there are a few of us who went to that same fellowship that I did that said, well, this is what I want to do. And so we set up collaborative models of teaching that particular part of the curriculum. And so I had done that in Texas, and then went to Connecticut and did that there, and then came to Charlotte, and similar issue here. So I collaborated with the psychologists in each of those departments to shape that curriculum. In all those cases, I was very welcomed because there's a point at which physicians, even enlightened, open-minded physicians, still will say to a psychologist, you don't know what it's like being a physician. And so having, it's just the way it is, right? I mean, it's just the way it is. So they're like, it's great to have a physician here saying this is important because it gives it credibility.
Yeah.
So that's why that's been what's propelled me through that, and to have these great partners and to work with to bring that education to the residents and the medical students.
And tell me a little bit about how that gets worked into the program. Now, admittedly, it's been a long time since I trained, but my memory of those years was that there was just such an incredibly huge volume of clinical stuff to be learned. And, there were grand rounds and special case conferences and M&M conferences and all these things that were aimed at understanding the pathophysiology of disease and those things that a physician must know. And nobody was talking about these very important things that you're bringing up right now. And I'm very interested to know how you managed to get that worked into the training curriculum.
Yeah, excellent. So different family medicine programs do this in different ways. The places that I went to actually had dedicated time devoted to the curriculum in lots of different formats. The one that I think was most successful, we actually had, a month set aside for a month of time or two set aside for just this training. Now, there's still clinical care going on. In family medicine, we're very focused on continuity of care. So the residents have their continuity panel of patients throughout all this. And what we did is we broke that month up into a longitudinal format. So we created in each of these places a 6-month curriculum where a group of residents would be with us an afternoon a week over 6 months. And we would explore these areas in that kind of a setting in a group learning format. And so it was group learning, which I got from my faculty development fellowship, highly experiential. We'd have them read an article or two. We would discuss. We actually did a lot of them bringing patients in and us all observing them with their patients, giving them feedback about their interpersonal style. We teach basic counseling skills and then have them practice that in both role plays as well as with real patients. We do some didactics about the most common mental health issues that show up in primary care, so that people have some familiarity with a biomedical as well as psychosocial way to treat that. So it's any number of ways in which to bring that education to them in some of the traditional formats as well as non-traditional formats. Another way is in the inpatient setting is having the behavioral medicine faculty round with the group and have an ear towards what's going on psychologically with this patient. Because it's, as you know, you're doing inpatient, it's high intensity, it's high volume, and we often don't have the time to listen for those things.
Right.
And so having somebody with that ear and go, gee, I wonder if this person is, whatever, this patient is blank. I wonder if you just ask that question, whether that might open up something and that could help them get out of here, or whatever that is. So that's another way to continue to bring that attention longitudinally to the learners.
It's a great idea. And Dael, is this something that is there some iteration of this present in virtually all family practice training programs or not?
Yes. To be accredited, you have to have some attention to the psychosocial aspects of healthcare and have to have a faculty member so designated. So there's a lot of different ways that it shows up. But to be accredited, all family medicine programs have that as part of their curriculum.
Any likelihood that we'll see it making an appearance in within the training of other specialties? I know I'm asking you for speculation, and I'm asking you for speculation.
Well, here's another area of that I'm familiar with. I don't know about all specialties, but general internal medicine brings attention to this. Pediatrics brings attention to this. I don't know the specifics of the amount of curriculum, but they have those elements in there as well. But this is jumping ahead a little bit because my area of interest now is in well-being, professional well-being, and on the resident level, there are now requirements from the ACGME that there has to be attention to well-being. Well, if we're going to be attending to the individual well-being, we also have to bring some attention to, when you bring attention to your own self well-being, it also invites you to think about how's this going for your patients as well. So I imagine that we'll see more of it in other types of training as well.
Well, and I asked the question primarily because nowadays you hear a lot of conversation about the B word, the burnout word. Never even brought up during my years, which I understand was back at about the time that they invented fire. But nonetheless, I think it's common knowledge now that burnout is a real thing, and we need to have some way to address it. I'm not surprised that the most effective place it's being addressed right now is in family practice training. But I'm wondering how we get it into other areas. You have any speculation on that?
Yeah, well, so it is a pretty high priority item for graduate medical education. I'm in the national conversation about that with the ACGME. It is now a guideline for all residency and fellowship programs that you must attend to resident well-being and fellow well-being. It's not necessarily curriculum like I just talked about, but there are things that you must, as a program director, demonstrate that you are doing to ensure that you are keeping them as well as you can, given there's still a lot of challenges with residency training. So the idea is that we reduce burnout and improve well-being, and there's a lot of energy in that right now. So it is there's a lot of energy in that right now, especially right now with our COVID-19 issues. Lots of concern on a national level about the impact this is having on all of us, but especially house staff, who often are the ones really, truly at the front lines. So we are attending to that, and lots of different ways of making sure that we are reacting, making sure that people have resources. Like I mentioned, I went to a therapist. Nobody knew about that, but they still don't have to know about that. But to know that there are mental health resources that are easily accessible and anonymous. But also, what are we doing preventatively? What are we doing as a program, as an institution that assists with being sure that people are taking good care of themselves through this? How are we arranging the workflow so that people don't get burnt out? We're constantly looking at that. We constantly have a lot of work to do in that area as well. Our hope is that we attend to this in such a way for the individual, but also the system is set up in such a way for people to be not just successful in their professional development, but also successful in their personal development and good self-caretaking skills.
Well, it's good to know that that it's part of the conversation, because it is an incredibly important subject to be dealt with. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share your expert knowledge on the subject. It's been great talking to you, but what I'd like to do now is move on into really my favorite part of the program, and that's where you get to give us your ideas on how to become successful. So I'm going to sit quietly, and Dr. Dael Waxman will give us his personal prescription for success.
Thank you, Randy. Well, number one is what I was just talking about. Number one is take care of yourself. And by this, I mean prioritize your health and well-being. This is the put your own oxygen mask on first analogy that we hear about when we fly. We can only give so much of ourselves before we are all used up. you have to restore and replenish or you're going to burn out. I learned this the hard way, and I burned out a few times before I actually started focusing on especially exercise, for example, but also sleep and social relationships. So exercise or physical activity, sleep, and social relationships are the three most consistent mitigators of burnout that we individuals have some control over. So take care of yourself. Number 2 is to honor the unique gifts that you bring to the profession, even if it seems unpopular or it seems a little bit weird. So as I was just recounting in a different way, that I had no words for what I was interested in early in medical school. My main interest was in this arena of person-centeredness and humanism, contextual care. And there was really no focus on this in medical school. So there were no models or reinforcement for it either, especially in those first 2 years. I just felt increasingly like an outsider as my classmates seemed absorbed in basic sciences. Well, I just couldn't draw a line between, say, histology and the person's experience of their illness. I knew, though, that this was important because I like all of us do, I kept hearing stories from neighbors and friends that they were not being treated well when they entered the medical setting. They weren't treated as a human. So I wanted to make a difference in that. And it wasn't easy to express it. Always. But piece by piece, this emphasis ended up being the focus of my academic career. And now, as we've discussed, patient-centered humanistic care is just part of the mainstream in education and healthcare, increasingly so. And my third prescription for success is don't just do something, stand there. This is my suggestion for clinical practice. And so the way I want to illustrate that is with a story from my mentor, Rick Kellerman, who I mentioned earlier was the physician I was with in Plainville, Kansas. My first day rounding with him in the hospital, we rounded on a patient with pancreatic cancer. And I had developed a relationship with this patient. There really wasn't anything that we were doing clinically. He was just in the hospital. I don't remember the exact reasons, probably low appetite and dehydration. And I remember watching Rick spending quite a bit of time with the patient, and a lot of that time in silence, just standing or sitting at the bedside, just being with him. And I, as this fourth-year medical student, feeling, really impotent and feeling helpless. I feel like I want to do something for this guy. We walked out in the hall, and I said to Rick, well, what do we do? What do we do to help this guy? And Rick said, we are just here with him. We care for him. We sit with him. We be with him. And so don't always feel like you have to do something. Stand there and be with. The therapeutic relationship is just what it says it is. It's therapeutic. And to just drop into that and be with and care for. And that's my prescription for success, Randy.
Well, Dael, thank you very much. That's really profound, and we are so grateful that you were able to be with us and share your story and share your prescriptions with us today. And before we go, we find that after these podcasts are aired, there is typically a good bit of interest in the interview guest. And if you would care to share with us, please, how people can contact you either by email or websites. If you've got past books that you'd like to tell us about or upcoming books, we'd love to hear about that, or anything that you would care to share, anything you got on your mind today.
All right, great. Well, sure. People can get hold of me by my email address, which is DAELWMD. My first name is spelled a little bit differently, so it's DAELWMD@gmail.com. And the other thing I have is a website that I just launched. I'm also a professional coach, and that website is dwaxmancoaching.com, DWAXMAN coaching.com. And you can contact me through there as well. And on that website, there's also upcoming presentations that I'm doing, and the ability to do webinars and do Zoom meetings for your group or whatever you have interest in. So those are the two ways to connect with me. Thank you for that opportunity.
Well, thank you for being with us, Dael. It's very kind of you to take the time, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and we hope you have a good day.
Pleasure's been mine, Randy. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
So that will wrap up another episode of Prescription for Success. But before we go, I really would like to invite you to visit our website at rxforsuccesspodcast.com. And while you're there, you can become a subscriber, and we hope you will. We'd also like to make you a part of the podcast. If you'd like to participate in that, just visit the website, click on the Contact Us button on the top of the homepage, and then scroll to the bottom and click on the red Record button. And at that point, all you have to do is go ahead and read us your personal prescription for success. If you stumble, like I do occasionally, all you have to do is start over, and we'll edit everything to make you sound just great. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much for listening today, and don't forget to fill your prescription for success with my next episode.